Welcome to Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. I'm your host, Julie Stark, and today we're going to speak with Stephanie Arnold. Stephanie is a producer and a speaker and an international best-selling author. She's also a speaker at the A.R.E, new on the roster, so we're happy to introduce her to you today. Welcome, Stephanie. We are so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to the conference.
So your path is absolutely fascinating. I've done a lot of listening and reading about your story, and I think that is the best place for us to begin. We're introducing you to the A.R.E audience as a new member of its speaker roster, and you have a story to share, and you also have an incredible backstory. So I'd like a little bit of that and a lot of the other. So I'm going to turn it over to your storytelling capabilities.
Thank you so much. So previously, before all of this happened, which I'll get to, I was a TV producer. So I worked in television. I produced a lot of reality shows, probably some of the ones that family and friends have watched for their guilty pleasures. And then at one point in my career, and there's Emmy nods, and I worked with a lot of big celebrities. At some point in my career, I was like, wow, I have all of this success, but I don't have love. And then I met a Yenta, a matchmaker, and that matchmaker introduced me to my now husband. And when I left Los Angeles and the entertainment industry, I moved to Chicago, which is basically where my industry kind of died. And so then what was there to produce? So I started to produce a family. And I have a stepdaughter, and she was 2 at the time. And then we worked really hard to have our first daughter, which was after 3 rounds of IVF. And everything went fine. Everything was great. And I still had my ties into the TV stuff, but I wasn't doing it as much. And then the second child was after 7 rounds of IVF. So it was a long process to get pregnant. During that second pregnancy, at the 20-week mark, which some of your audience might be familiar with, at the 20-week ultrasound, that's when they determine the size of the baby, the quadrants of the heart, the spine, the fingers, everything else, that everything is fine. And just so you know, my husband is a PhD in economics from University of Chicago. He was a former Air Force pilot. And at the time, he was the chief economist for the New York Attorney General's office. So we were splitting our time between New York and Chicago. And in New York, the radiologist's office is separate from the OB's, your gynecologist's office. And the radiologist said, oh, everything's fine, but you have a placenta previa. And he's like, I'll be right back. And then he walked out. And I looked at my husband and I said, I don't know what this is, but I've got a bad feeling about it. And I'm already special in a category with my blood type. I'm O negative, which is 7% of this population. I said, I don't want to be special in any other category. I really have a bad feeling. It was a heavy knowing, what I call it. And my husband, as logical as he is and data-driven as he is, he's like, honey, we don't have all the information. You're getting great prenatal care. It's okay. The doctors are telling you that it's not a problem. It's a 1 in 200 risk. Worst case scenario, ultimately, when we got more information, worst case scenario is you'd have a C-section. And I had a C-section with my first. So it wasn't this fear of this known aspect. It really was a fear of the unknown. And then I went home, like every normal person would do, and Dr. Google started going on, researching, and I saw that a placenta previa could turn into an accreta, which is basically where the placenta, and so a placenta previa is basically the placenta is growing on top of the cervix. And as the belly grows, as the uterus grows, if it doesn't move out of the way, that's why they would do a C-section, right? And so if it turns into an accreta, which is when the placenta merges into the uterus, if that happens, you might bleed. If that happens, and I'm reading this domino effect, if that happens, you might need a hysterectomy. If that happens, you might hemorrhage. And if that happens, you and the baby might lose your life. So I pushed the computer back and I looked at my husband and I said, this is going to happen to us. The only difference is the baby's going to survive. And so he's like, of course, he looks at it, he's like, honey, what you're worried about is a half a percent chance of happening. This is not going to happen. You know, this is ridiculous. Get it out of your head. But I knew this was going to happen. So I didn't just tell him. Crazy hormonal, pregnant, neurotic Jewish woman, started talking to everybody you'd meet. If you saw me out walking, and this happened in Starbucks at one point, this woman, was pregnant, and she's like, oh, how's the pregnancy going? I'm like, I'm gonna die. It was, friends stayed away from me. Nobody talked to me. Like, they were all like, okay, something's up. Maybe there's too much, because I was having a boy. Maybe there was too much testosterone. It was driving me crazy. So nobody really knew. I told every doctor, every nurse, I said, look, my placenta previa is going to turn to an accreta. I'm going to hemorrhage. You guys are going to need a lot of blood. You're going to cut me from sternum to pelvis. The baby's going to be fine. I'm going to be down the operating table. And I told every single person. And of course, in their defenses, the tests were negative. All of the tests were negative. The amniotic fluid was fine. The baby was fine. Everything was growing fine. But I still had this ominous feeling that this was happening. So imagine as you're driving on an open road and everybody is seeing a cleared open road, and all you see is an 18-wheeler headed straight for you, and nobody is listening to you.
Right. Wow.
So at some point, I made an appointment with the head of gynecological oncology at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. And I said, I had learned that your OB, if you need a hysterectomy during delivery, the OB won't do it. They'll transfer you to maternal fetal medicine. So you don't want a maternal fetal medicine, just for your audience to know, in case you're ever in this position. So you don't want an MFM to do it. You actually want a gynonc to do it, because a gynonc has more experience with high risk reproductive organ surgeries. And when 20% of your blood supply is going to your uterus, that would constitute a high risk surgery. So you can imagine, my husband went with me to every single one of these appointments, and the tests are negative. And he's like, we're sitting in the waiting room. The women that are in the waiting room have no hair, have IVs in their arm. They're suffering from cancer. And he's like, I am embarrassed to be here. And I said, I don't know what to tell you, because, everybody is telling me nothing's wrong. Maybe this doctor has heard of something, some sort of foreboding that a patient is having, and maybe he will hear it differently because everybody else is not. And so we get into the appointment, and I'm there with the resident taking the notes, and he's like, how can I help you? And I said, well, this is going to happen. This is going to happen. He's like, well, who told you you had an accreta? No one. It doesn't show on your charts that you have an accreta. No. Have you been on the internet, Mrs. Arnold? I was like, why, yes, I have, but this is going to happen. So he's like, why don't we get an MRI? If the MRI is positive for an accreta, I will schedule myself on your mandatory C-section at 37 weeks. I'll take care of it. And I felt better because I had something else to do. But the MRI was negative, and my husband says, you should feel better. And I said, I am feeling much worse because now I'm running out of people to tell this crazy foreboding story to. So at some point, my OB was like, do you want to have a consultation with anesthesia? I'm like, yeah, it's another person to talk to. And so I speak to the anesthesiologist. She's on the phone with me, and she's giving me like where I'd have the epidural, the recovery, whatever. And then I explain one more time what happens in the event this, and this happens. And she said later that she was startled. She had never had a patient speak so clearly about what was going to happen, had sought out specialists to save her life, and had also had a baby in a C-section before. So she was a little, unnerved by the whole situation. Mm-hmm. And so, but I didn't know. And so she said to me, look, Ms. Arnold, we're a teaching hospital. We're prepared for every emergency. We do emergency drills weekly, all of these things. I hope you feel better. And I was like, it is what it is. So what else do you do when you're desperate? You take to Facebook. I said, hey, I'm gonna need a lot of blood. So I'm gonna be giving birth in a couple weeks or 3 weeks or something like that. I said, I'm gonna need a lot of blood. And people were like, okay, are you okay? And it wasn't like logically that I knew people would donate blood. But again, maybe somebody had a cousin or a friend who had experienced kind of premonitions during pregnancy, but they never came. Nobody. And any kind of research I ever did about pregnancy premonitions, right, they weren't there. And so, so then 36 weeks to the day, my husband's in New York, and I know the day, this is the day I'm going to deliver this baby. And so, as luck would have it, or a higher power would determine, I said goodbye to him on a Skype chat. I kissed my daughter, who was 2 at the time, a million times. I was convinced I was never going to see either one again. And they wheeled me down to the operating room and wheeled me into the room that was going to give birth to my son, or give life to my son and take mine. And when I'm being wheeled in, I'm telling my doctor, there is something wrong. You need to put me under general anesthesia. And my doctor's like, Stephanie, I know you're scared. I know Jonathan's not here, but you're in good hands. You know, if I put you to sleep, I put the baby to sleep, it's more dangerous. Let's just get him out. Everything is fine. And you've been stressed. And that was my last ditch effort. And I remember talking to an anesthesiologist one time who said, you know, Stephanie, if you were my patient, when I hear this kind of foreboding, I wouldn't do the procedure. I said, but this baby was coming out no matter what. This was happening no matter what. And so, wow. So you can imagine, none of us that I've talked to has ever been buried alive, but you can imagine having those last few breaths prior to lights out. That's what it felt like. It was highly palpable, the fear, the anxiety. I was having a C-section, so they put a curtain in front of my face. They delivered Jacob happy and healthy, and seconds later, I'm dead.
Wow.
And now I'll shut up because like I was doing a lot of talking.
No. So, but that's a good intermission here, because you died. You literally died on the table. And I think in hearing your story, Stephanie, the thing that probably for most people, or I would even venture to say most women, stands out is that not only did you have this intuition, but you like shouted it from the rooftops, right? So, you know, Edgar Cayce often says that a life without intuition is like being on a rudderless ship, but how many of us really connect to it, much less trust it, right? Which he also thought was, you know, essential to living a complete and whole life. But you were able, I want to know where you got that fortitude to just insist. Doctors, family members, everyone, Facebook, not even Facebook, you know, right? But you kept like, where did that come from? Where did that knowing and that deep sense come from?
I think I didn't have time to think about it. I was busy saving my life. So what I tell people is like, you will never regret speaking up and being wrong. If I was wrong, thank God I was wrong. I would send flowers and chocolates. I would never have another baby again. Right. So like, Thank you. I was crazy. I was hormonal. You're right. Everybody's right. Okay. So what? They're judging you. They judge you for your Instagram profile. It doesn't make a difference. Right.
It's a whole world of judgment. Right.
Yeah. So I think that you will never regret speaking up and being wrong, but you absolutely will regret not speaking up and being dead right.
But it's so hard to get people to listen to you, and especially in the medical community. I mean, no offense to anyone out there that's in the medical community, but really being heard. And you were loud and proud about this. Now, I can't imagine going to what you knew, no one else apparently did, was your imminent demise. And so, what happened? What happened then?
Yeah. So I was clinically dead for 37 seconds. I ended up having a very rare pregnancy complication that I didn't know about. It's called an amniotic fluid embolism, and it's where amniotic cells get into the mother's bloodstream. And if you happen to be allergic to it, your body goes into somewhat of an anaphylactic shock. And the first part of it is you go into cardiac arrest and you flatline. And if you're lucky enough to be resuscitated from that, which 40% are, then your body goes into DIC, which is your body's inability to clot blood. And so there was I predicted a lot of things. The cascade of events, I predicted every single one of them. But what I didn't predict is that there was something in the operating room. There were life-saving measures already in place, which was extra blood in a crash cart. And those were put in place by the anesthesiologist, that last phone call that I made. I did not know she heard me. She flagged my file and incorporated those because she was uncomfortable with the conversation we had had. And so they resuscitate me, then DIC starts. So, I lose 3 times my blood supply, and I'm O negative, so I can only receive O negative blood. And at that point, they think they stopped the bleed and they transfer me to the surgical ICU on life support. They put me in a medically induced coma, and my husband shows up. And so they explained to him, right? So he texted the doctor who we're friends with, and it's like, how's everything going? Because he knew how stressed I was, and he was on a plane, and then he couldn't hear from me. And so the doctor's like, baby's fine, Stephanie's stable. Now, my husband's smart enough to know that that's not good. And so he gets to the hospital, the anesthesiologist explains what it is. And he says it wasn't intuitive of him. He says it wasn't a conscious thing, but I'm going to call BS on him. He said that if she needs a hysterectomy, this is the doctor we met with 2 months before. And they were a little startled by it, taken aback by it, because why would you meet with somebody about this? But they said, look, she won't survive another surgery, but we think we stopped the bleed, and we don't think she'll need it. Okay, fine. And then he goes to visit Jacob in the nursery, and then he comes to see me. And 7 hours later, it turns out I'm still bleeding, and they take me back into the OR, and they had called in the gynonc that I had met with to perform the hysterectomy. When they did the pathology on the uterus, they showed that an accreta had started to form, but the MRI didn't pick it up when it was taken. So everything had happened. All 6 of my premonitions had happened. And so then, I'm in the hospital, kidney failure, everything, like it was Armageddon on my body. By about 7 days later, on day 8, we're Jewish, so we have to have a bris, a circumcision for the boy. And, he's like, well, my wife's in a coma. And everybody's like, then you pray. There's whatever you do. So every doctor, nurse, different denominations, spiritualities, they all prayed. And on the 6th day, let there be light. No, on the 6th day, so the 6th day, they extubate me. They take out the tube to take me off the meds to see where I am, because there's no guarantee what I had, if I lost the oxygenation, if there was brain damage, what have you. They couldn't guarantee any of it. They pulled me out, and now I have severe edema, and I look down at my swollen belly, and I'm like, am I still fucking pregnant? And I was like stressed like that. And my husband looked at it and said, she's going to be okay. Kira, she knew where she was, and she was cursing. So, but meanwhile, every doctor, every department, I'm in a teaching hospital with residents, and they're like, how did you know?
Right.
Because they all were like, foreboding exists prior to a heart attack or an embolus, but moments before, a day before, but 3 months before in the detail, no, I'm sorry. And I said, well, you need to tell me, there has to be other patients that have experienced this. And they were like, we haven't seen it, or maybe they're not vocal about it. But part of it was like, okay, well, my voice saved my life, which was a huge burden and relief coming out of it. And I tell clinicians, because I talk at a lot of hospitals, that please do not, when a patient comes out of something like this, say it's a miracle you survived, right? God has a plan for you, because the gravity of the situation, just when you're starting to come out of it or trying to recover, the thought that your life has now completely shifted, and now there's a miracle. And what if I was perfectly happy serving burgers at a restaurant, and now you're telling me I have a bigger calling in my life, and now all of a sudden I have to deal with all, I don't know. So there was a lot of that. And then of course my husband was happy that I survived and wanted to get back to normal. His Air Force mentality was like, suppress, repress, let's move on. I was like, oh, no. Now y'all didn't hear me before, you're gonna hear me now. And so then when I was strong enough, I joined the board of the Amniotic Fluid Embolism Foundation. I started talking about my story because, like I said, I couldn't find anybody talking about, premonitions during pregnancy. And I'm like, if any woman has anxious feelings, sometimes it might not be an anxiety or neurosis, or maybe it's just a knowing. Mm-hmm. And they need to be taken more seriously. So started that path. And then part of it was, I want to know what happened during the 37 seconds. I was on a talk show with a host, and he's like, did you see the light? I'm like, I don't know, man. They gave me a lot of drugs, and I was not poo-pooing it in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I am spiritual. I was brought up as a religious Jew. I'm educated. I believe in God. But to, at this point, say that where life ends, where consciousness ends or begins, it was out of my wheelhouse. But if there was a way to understand it, I wanted to. Mm-hmm. So traditional therapy wasn't helping me. And even though physically I was getting back to being stronger, mentally I was a wreck. And everybody and anybody just wanted to be like, oh, it's an amazing story, but wanted to just kind of like, well, you're healthy now, let's move on. And it's you're still having severe trauma. And I wanted to piece together, nobody can answer me the 3 months I saw it coming. What if it happens again? What if I feel like I'm gonna have a heart attack and then I'm gonna spontaneously combust? I want to actually understand the mechanics of how it works. So I enlisted a regression therapist, which she worked with Brian Weiss, Dr. Brian Weiss, for many years, but there was something in her voice. She's a Cuban Jew, and that's my background as well. And so I said to her, there was just a familiarity in her voice, and I did it over Skype or a video chat, and I videotaped it, which I'm going to show at the conference. I'll show snippets of the therapy. And because I videotaped it, you could actually see moments. And I by the way, I wasn't so optimistic this was going to help. I was like, look, there was nothing typical about our story. Why would I think typical therapy would work? Right. So I go to, so we have like 10, 20, 30 hours of therapy. By the time she got me back into the OR, you could see my body in this video, and I don't know whether there were snippets out
and
there.
This was during the regression when you were doing this and recording it. Okay, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you could see me actually when I'm finally just about to flatline. You see my body shaking and convulsing, and then collapse, and then I start describing what's happening after I flatline, like which nurse jumped on my chest to give me CPR, which nurse hit the button for the code, what my doctors were doing, my anesthesiologist by my feet, what was happening down the hall, what my daughter was doing in the labor and delivery room, what my husband wore getting off the plane from New York, just like all these things. And then I saw spirits. I saw hundreds of spirits, and I saw ones I knew, and I'm quite aware that psychologists say, of course, when you're having a near-death experience or you're traumatized, of course you want your loved ones there to hold your hands, but that's wishful thinking. I'm like, okay, well, let's put a pin in that one for a second. It's the ones I did not know that had messages for the ones I do know here. And when all of that was revealed to me and I came out of that hypnotherapy, I just felt lighter, like I had connected certain dots. And I have no idea whether I made it up or not, right? But I felt better. And so, of course, it's very graphic, and my husband cannot stand to watch me in pain. So he watched it for 1 second, and he's like, shut it down. And he's like, how do you know this isn't a recalled episode of Grey's Anatomy in your head?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well,
He did
people
not.
want to wrap logic around these things that are unexplainable, right? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
We were not on friendly terms at that moment.
Yeah,
So,
I imagine not.
but I have to say that the gift of who my husband is he challenges me, and because he's a critical thinker, what could have been me accepting everything for what it was, I could have accepted absolutely that what I did was the right place. It felt right. I knew it was right. I knew it in my heart, but what he wanted was proof. So everything that I have done, including writing this book, was really to prove to him that I was not a liar, like that this experience was real. And by the way, Mofo, you witnessed most of it.
Right.
And
So
I'm
it
not gonna
pushed
let you get
you.
away.
It pushed you a little bit
did.
more instead of just accepting it. You know,
did.
I find so many layers to this story, so fascinating. And I imagine that, in 1923, when Edgar Cayce was like going into these sleeping trances, and he believed that psychic is of the soul, right? And he was doing this and telling people, here's what I got, you've got this, and you need this to fix that, and giving all of, as a medical intuitive. But he would also say, oh yeah, there's spirit, there are thousands in the room right now. They're here. They're all around us all the time. 100 years ago. And here you are in the 21st century, or maybe it was the 20th century. No, it was the 21st century when it happened, right?
Yeah.
Still having to convince the logical mind, the scientific community, these things that can't be explained with facts and hard, cold logic, right?
Well, but
there's
also-
so much
also-
of that existing.
Yeah, but also my soulmate, the love of my life,
Yeah,
the most
that's
important person
hard.
in
Yeah.
the world to me,
Yeah.
doesn't believe this is real. Now you're basically discounting my entire life and
Right.
this huge life-altering experience. And by the way, if you're not along on this vibration with me,
Yeah.
then what kind of relationship do we have? And so it wasn't until Netflix did the surviving death.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, I don't know whether you saw that moment where, right. So it caught me off guard when Jonathan finally said, I believe you. I did a freaking Ricky Stern, to director. She was like, Stephanie, what's going on? I'm like, I'm going to kill you, because I wasn't expecting those words, what he said, for me to have the reaction I had. And it was so raw that's it, all these years later. Like, this happened
Right.
9 years ago, and Netflix aired a year ago. And so it's like all of those 8 years of me just needing to hear those words.
Oh, I can feel that, Stephanie. When I saw that scene, I saw the body language, I could feel the energy between the two of you, and I thought, wow, not only have you had the obvious journey that you've had, and then the maybe not so obvious journey that you've had, that you're so openly sharing with people, and that's risky, right? But that you're also sharing this aspect of your relationship, right? That was very challenging with this person that is like your person, right?
Yeah,
And to do
100%.
that, 100%. And I don't think that ever, I didn't ever get the sense that was any different, but kudos to you both for going there, because you're like this together,
Yeah, and you know what? I was proud of him. Like, there was a chapter in my book he just refused to write, and I said, you have to write it, because I was in a coma. I can't talk for myself. People want to know what you were doing after the 3 months of me telling you what's going on. He's like, this isn't my book. So he was fighting it and fighting it and fighting it. And so you could tell he compartmentalizes any kind of trauma, which is what most men do. And then, with that, like, kudos to him. He's gotten on stage with me at hospitals and, in front of nurses organizations, because he's, he understands the importance now of just listening to your intuition. He might call it something else, but it doesn't make a difference. I mean, I look at it, I'm like, I do not care whether you think that it comes from a spiritual or scientific place, whether we're hardwired for it, or whether you think God sent you this message. The reality is, it's doing something in your body to tell you something is wrong. So speak up, because if you don't, it could make the difference of life and death.
Well, and there is a sixth sense. Cayce refers to it in his material all of the time, and it's the soul sixth sense. Like, we think of hearing, seeing, touching, tasting, feeling, and then knowing. And that's what you called it, was knowing.
Yeah.
That's what he called it too, is this knowing, right? This sixth sense of your soul. And when he would go into his trances, he would often say that the information's coming from nowhere and everywhere at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So I just find that really fascinating that you have, you grabbed onto that intuition. You said, this is what's happening in my life. This is what's gonna happen. It did happen. And even the naysayers are a little bit still naysaying, but they're going, oh, maybe, maybe a little.
And then I realized after that, the therapy that I did and the videotape, you know, when he said it's Grey's Anatomy, I said, you know what? I called my therapist and I said, how do you know what I'm telling you is true? And she said, sometimes the only validation we get is the patient feels better and you feel better. And I said, that's not good enough for me. I have witnesses. So then, of course, Jonathan wanted to be in on the conversation. So Jonathan said, I'm going with you to the hospital. I meet with the doctors with you. I want to watch their reaction when they play the tape for them. No hearsay, no conversations. Keep it to the. So I handed it to them. My one doctor started crying, and that she's on the Netflix show. The anesthesiologist was like, you know, I'm a skeptical person, but she's like, you're calling into question everything I've learned in medical school. The other doctors are like, it's accurate down to where we were standing, what we were doing. Of course, the hearing is the last to go, but you most certainly couldn't see. And when you were intubated, your eyes were taped shut. And so it was, and then there was a nurse that came up to me and she said, you know, Mrs. Arnold, I'm sure you don't remember me, but I'm glad to see that you're walking again. And I said, you're the one that broke my ribs. And she said, and I do it again to save your life. And I was told later that she went back to her office and cried because I shouldn't know that. I shouldn't know that was who she was a year later.
And what was the anesthesiologist's name that brought the extra blood and the crash cart, I believe, into the room during delivery?
Dr. Grace Lim.
Right, Grace.
Yeah. And she says she's a very spiritual person, but she didn't learn that obviously in medical school. But she always, you know, understands that before she walks into a patient's room that there's a reason why she's coming into their line of sight.
Well, and you know, you bring up something interesting because you did say that you needed to go into therapy because I think I heard you say that you, after the experience, it was as if your soul had separated from your body and you were really traumatized, rightly so, but and needing traditional therapy wasn't working. So you did this regression therapy. And I've done regression therapy myself, and I've done past life regression, you know, to access things. And I'm with you, like, it doesn't really matter to me whether or not the story I'm observing and feeling all the emotions as part of is true or not. What matters is that I feel better now. Like, it helps me with today and whatever it was I was dealing with, because our subconscious is so powerful. And Casey believed that, you believe that, I believe that, many, many people believe that. So accessing it in your normal waking life, or accessing it purposefully through regression, or the dream state. You know, Casey was a big believer in the power of dreams to be the bridge between what you're living right now and maybe something you're trying to work out, and your subconscious is able to do that. Was this all coming at you in the waking state, or did you have any dreams that validated that? I know you did the regression that.
When I was going through the premonitions?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
No, it was when I was awake. I was on this, like, I'd be grocery shopping and I'd have a flash, or I'd be reading a book to my daughter, go to a mommy and me class. I couldn't sleep. I mean, you know, when you're pregnant and you're just like the heartburn, everything else that you've got going on. And I was conscious that the day that I gave birth was the day I was going to die. So I had very little time to spend time with my family. So every waking moment was a moment that I could spend time with my family. And I wasted it because wasted it because I was on this frenzy to save my life.
Yeah, right.
And then had it gone and stayed the wrong way, I would have taken that time. I could have had moments and was desperate to, you know, stay alive. So I wasn't really connecting as much.
Well, you do have a family member, I believe, that you resemble, right?
Yeah,
that had some gifts as well, right? And Casey believes that we all have them, and the more that we, you know, connect with them, the more we can trust them, the more experiences we'll have. I often call it in my own life like Hansel and Greteling, like following the little breadcrumbs along the way of, and if you're not sure about it, and maybe you have some advice of how people can access that, but I always say, start small. Like if you always go to work the same way, but one day you have a hunch to turn left instead of right, just go left. Like begin giving signals to your intuition that, okay, I'm listening. It doesn't have to be big things like, doctor, I'm gonna die.
No. And I tell people also the same way, because women and men say to me, after the 10th doctor said you were crazy, I would have stayed quiet. And I was like, then you would have stayed dead. And so the way that I look at intuition is like, the reality is we don't trust it enough, just like what you were saying in the beginning. And so we try with small things. So if you have a dream that startles you, that wakes you up, I would write down, like keep a notebook with you, write down the date, write down all the details. If you're afraid to speak up about something, if you're afraid that you're going to put out bad juju into the universe because you got these feelings that someone is going to die, and you don't want to say that, and you don't want to tell them that, start writing down things. Start thinking, if somebody's calling you, maybe don't look at the caller ID and wonder, okay, let me guess if that person is, because there's a ring that you feel that could be your mother, or could be your daughter, or could be whoever. And so when you start writing it down, you start feeling in your body differently. And you feel like, if it's, I know that when I feel it in my gut, like literal, like butterflies, or the hair on the back of my neck, or especially if visions are incessant. The difference between a premonition and a casual thought is very different. And I've given this example before. You're sitting on an airplane. You might be a nervous flyer. You have a fleeting moment that's like, airplanes crash. Oh my God, this plane is going to crash, right? That is a fleeting moment. It did not. It's going to be fine. However, if weeks leading up to your flight, you're like, I shouldn't take this plane. I really don't want to go. I don't know why. It's kind of gnawing, at my, the back of my head. Maybe you should change the flight if you can.
Right.
Not because the plane might crash, but maybe you are needed at the time you're supposed to fly. But there's something that's pulling you. And so, but it's nonstop. My premonitions were nonstop. They did not go away that entire 3 months. It was not something that was just a casual dream and then it went away. Yeah.
That's really, really great advice. And I think if you can take those small steps to do that, write down your dreams, or just pay attention to those small hunches, that you can get to this, because we all want to have the voice that Stephanie had to advocate for ourselves. And I know that, a lot of people are probably interested in the NDE and your experience with that, which is vitally important. And I'm really fascinated by the regression that you did to access more information around this experience. We have another speaker here at A.R.E., Dr. Eben Alexander, who is a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon who was very much a skeptic, probably that analytical left brain guy, much like your husband, who had an NDE, and now his life has completely changed, and that's what he talks about. But he says that he uses sound and vibration and tones to go back to that moment, and he actually gets more information about, the life after life component surrounding that, which I find fascinating. Casey said there was no real line of demarcation. Life and death are a continuous stream. I know that, well, I say I know that, but I'll let you tell us about, a couple of things. One, others report that their NDEs changed their lives, and they may have been going this way, and now they're, 180 degrees, they're going a different way. I'm curious about that for you. And then I'm also curious about what you've determined is your thing to share with people out of this experience, because I know it's really, really specific for you.
Yeah, so the NDE, of course, changed my life. My life's perspective is different. It's like once, I equate it to like the curtain being pulled back on Oz. Like it was always there. Now I can see it clearly. I don't question that kind of vibration that I feel when I feel something is off. Like I lean into it. I am much more careful about the filter I have, because when it first happened, I was getting energy from all different sources. So you go asystolic, and which is no electricity running through your body. Then you get plugged back in and you're on high voltage. So you don't know how to harness it. You just start feeling everything, and it's too overwhelming, where you're feeling like everybody's energy around you, and everybody's made up of energy. So you wanted to shut it down and hide. It changed me because, I was always, I've been working in television since I was 14 years old, and I was telling other people's stories. And then I worked on a lot of reality shows that I felt for sure I was going to hell for. And then, and then you die and come back. So it was kind of a rebirth. So I'm like, okay, I paid my dues. And now the kind of content I'm putting out there is so connected to who I am. Like, I feel that in reading a lot of Casey's stuff, I feel like my calling is more of a medical intuitive, not a psychic reader, medium. I do not believe that is my calling. I mean, people ask, like, you were brought back for a reason. I'm like, to me, I look at that as somewhat disrespectful to the people who have died of the exact same thing that I had, because two women will each week. And so I feel it's not that. And I don't go into, when I speak, I don't go into a ton of information on the near-death experience and the afterlife. Yes, I honor it. Yes, I believe in consciousness after the brain shuts down. I've experienced all these things, but I believe I'm filling some level of a void between science and spirit, especially when it comes to the healthcare world, and being a patient advocate, and also being an advocate for the doctors too, because I feel like we really need to go back to narrative medicine. There is one of the things that I say all the time is that, my doctors were missing one key important factor, which was, I was their patient for many years. I have had a baby before. This was not typical behavior for me. And they were ignoring that fact. They put me in a category, in a box of a healthy 41-year-old woman, yes, advanced maternal age, all these other things, but they were missing all of that. And I think that when clinicians will actually talk, because the nurses happen to be very good, a lot of them, not all of them, a lot of them happen to be very good about connecting with patients and their families, they learn more about the connective tissue of that patient and what their patient needs are. So if they have a near-death experience, if they have something that their sixth sense is telling them, their intuition is telling them, I also remind them they themselves have intuition as well. This was something that they were not using when it came to their patient. And so, has it changed my life? Yeah, it's absolutely changed my life. My mission in life is much heavier than producing reality shows that I did for entertainment, and they definitely serve a purpose, because people need a break from their own reality. But I think I went through this in order to get out the other side of it, to share this information, because again, when I was going through it, it wasn't there.
Stephanie, I think that I look at this in my own life, and I know that every moment prior to the moment that I'm in has prepared me for the moment that I'm in, right? So even when you look back, you look at your familial story, right, with, a gifted grandmother, and you look at your career path in reality television, you look at the love that you found with your husband and this very logical, reasonable-minded man. And then you look at this experience, and now I've got chills, right? It all has kind of come together, because this is a reality story, right? And the fact that you can bring science to bear on something that is so intangible, right, comes from what you mentioned earlier, in part, that connection with your husband, who, sort of made you go a little deeper and explain a little harder, kind of both of you reaching across that bridge. But so much of this has always been looked at. That's why I really applaud Edgar Cayce for doing what he did at the time that he did it. My great-grandfather was friends with him, and he was a member of the Spiritualist Church as well. So I grew up with those stories as a kid, as my dad did, and his brothers and sisters. But it's a little fringy, right? It can be a little bit fringy, and to have people speak it into day to day, right? And then use it in a way, you know, being an advocate for doctors and patients, right? And for all, but I have a particular, I guess, personal experience with being a woman and being heard in the medical community. I mean, what a great way to spend your life, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah, my husband's like, you know, I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you're doing this, but he's like, I don't want to talk anymore about this.
Right, I'm done.
He's like, I just want to go to dinner. And I was like, yeah, well, I know it's not his mission in life. I know it's mine. And learning how to have a normal everyday relationship with your spouse, and also understand, because I think one of the takeaways from that the Netflix thing was I got a lot of emails from people saying, please forgive your husband. And I'm like, well, let's and he's like, you threw me under the bus. I'm like, first of all, I didn't know I was going to react that way, right? But he's like, they're like, please forgive him. I'm like, first of all, I forgive him. I said, but it took me a long time to recognize he could only give me what he could give, because if he started believing what I know to be true, that would crack the very foundation on which he stands.
Right.
So he needs to have the mathematics, he needs to have the data that he has, and then the rest of it he'll leave up to me to save the family, right?
It's a good union, you know. There's the yin and yang is there for sure, right? Like you fill in the spaces for each other. I think that's fantastic. You know, Casey said if you wanted to live a conscious or awakened life, that you really had to pay attention to your intuition. Clearly, you've done that. He also thought meditation, prayer, dreams, anything that could help you access the subconscious. So you are, I think, a shining example of all of those things and what you have done with your life since, and as you continue to evolve. I know you had a spiritual transformation, mental transformation, and now you have embarked on a physical transformation. And I think that people are going to be really excited to learn, you know, where you are with life and what you're doing now. So where can they find out about you? I know you've got a book, a screenplay, Netflix. Go ahead.
Where am I right now? I wrote the screenplay from the book. I adapted the book. So I wrote a book called 37 Seconds. It's in, I think, 8 languages now, and it's and it did well. And then I did a huge media blitz tour, and then I also did it in Spanish language as well. And then I met with people about the rights for the book, sold the rights to Hawk Koch, who used to be the president of the Academy Awards. And we are currently looking at directors for the movie. That was not an easy thing to do because the book is my truth. So writing a fictionalized version or a cinematic version of it was really not easy. So we'll see where that goes. And then I signed on with the Netflix people to do a podcast called Knowing, because I don't believe it is just my story. And the more that my story got out there, the more people would reach out to me and talk about their own knowings. And so I like to say, you know, you don't know how you know, you just do. I don't know whether we will ever know really truly how the mechanics work. And some people talk to me about quantum entanglement, physics and what have you, but it's too heady for me to process. So I'm trying to dilute it enough where I can understand it, but it's still hard. And so then I've started to come up with the second book, because it's taken me a while to think about, I have my story, which I knew there was a book there, or I didn't know, but somebody else knew that it was a book. And then I was like, I'm not going to put out a book just for the sake of books, but I've been doing this bodybuilding journey, which is a real weird kind of thing, because I'm not an athlete and I am goal oriented, but doing something like this, I think I went a little backwards. So I had this spirituality first. So when people talk about transformations, like mind, body, spirit, I had the spiritual experience first, then the mind was connecting everything afterwards. And I've had massive scars, and my woman had taken away from me, and all of these things, and I would never go back under the knife electively to fix things. So I decided, okay, I'm a total immersion kind of person, goal-oriented. How do I get there fast? And everything I read was about this bodybuilding, like bikini bodybuilding. So I talk about spirituality in a glittery bikini and stripper heels. But so I did my first competition 2 or 3 years ago, and I was 48 at the time, and I owned my body. Like, I finally felt like the warrior outside that I felt inside. And so I decided at 50 years old to do it again, because I'm like, this is the new 50. And then through that, I host a weekly clubhouse, and I talk to a lot of people about trauma and healing, and also how trauma ignites your superpowers. And so I believe that the second book might deal a lot of that, because all of these empaths and intuitives that I have met, and these that have these superpowers, a lot of it got ignited from trauma. And I have little bandwidth. I mean, I have a lot of bandwidth in empathy and sympathy for people that have gone through a whole heck of a lot. But I also will be the mirror where I'm like, okay, you can change it. You can change your body. You can change all of this, but you should have to want to. And so at some point, I'm like, just stop complaining or shut up. So
right.
And it's not to be mean or whatever, but I'm using it as my own example. It's like, it also gives me something to focus on instead of the pain. And so it also pushes me further away from the pain and the trauma. And so intuitively, it was the right thing for me. So yeah.
Well, you are absolutely an inspiration, and you have to promise me once you get this second book done, we reconvene for part 2, and we'll talk about trauma and how trauma can move your life forward, because I absolutely believe that too. I could really honestly just talk to you forever, because there's so much that we haven't uncovered. But if people want to know more about you, tell them where to find.
Yeah, my website is stephaniearnold.net. I'm on Instagram at StephArnold37, SEPH. And then I just started TikTok, and I'm really enjoying just, quickly doing things. But the audience there, it's interesting. Millennials, younger, also are very spiritual. So they're looking at content there from a very real, painful place, and it's quite enlightening for me. It's like weird to say that an app can do that, but it really is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really is. I've recently had an experience with TikTok, and I'm pleasantly surprised with what's going on. So we'll save that for the next time. But thank you so much for being with us today and sharing this story. I'm sure there'll be many questions, and then we're so glad to have you as part of the A.R.E. family over here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you.
Okay, take
Enjoy
care.
your day. Bye-bye.